The title of the talk is Spheres, Cones, and Cylinders, which is kind of just a straightforward admission of things that I like in architectural form. And I think maybe to address the theme of authenticity will help to kind of position some of the work moving forward. So in reading the brief for authenticity, it occurred to me that my work sort of operates through inverse veils of architectural form and a kind of expanded field of influences, different kind of cultural and political influences, where I'm particularly interested and maybe attentive to their kind of uncanny or maybe unsuspecting points of contact. And so maybe not so much about a kind of explicit historicist retreat to copies, nor about a kind of digital exuberance or even a kind of fidelity to particular techniques. The work is more interested in syncing aesthetics with politics, materiality with technology, history with contemporary culture, all through a kind of recomposing and re-authoring of the familiar, the commonplace, and sort of existing within the marginal. Furthermore, I think what is really preferenced in the work is an architectural language that is underpinned by kind of extremely conventional and, in fact, traditional means of architectural representation. So my affinity for scaled drawings and models and images sort of places the work squarely on the shoulders of a disciplinary tradition in which these are representations of the things, they are not the things themselves. So within that, the work then sort of lays claim to, despite its kind of speciations and genres that it falls within, it always comes back to a kind of grounding center through representation. So the work really aims and intends to look at things sort of maybe missed or unnoticed previously, including spaces, forms, contexts, etc. So I kind of take a cue from this image, which I love, for the kind of pleasurable and mysterious curiosities that can be found, in this case in the HVAC system, over the kind of immediacy of the art in the gallery. So in other words, in responding directly to the theme, let's say if we accept that the value of originality is no longer the only prerequisite to authenticity, we are free to reclaim the commonplace, the familiar, and the banal as curiosities. So I'm going to outline both form and context, which Carrie, I think, did a wonderful job of outlining for me previously. I'm going to start with form, which is a sort of inverse role of how we normally, I think, talk about relationships between form and context. The reason for this is one which assumes form to be a kind of protagonist, or a way of re-authoring particular contexts. And I'm going to do this through what I'm calling the generic original. So I've always kind of been fascinated with primitive geometries, and in particularly, maybe not so much the kind of singular, but the aggregation of primitive geometries. And so these drawings of Louis Mondit, called Some Penetrations of Solids, for me introduce a range of architectural problems. They speak to ideas of aggregation, geometry, projection, mass, form, figure, profile, silhouette, but they do it also in a way where they have a kind of idea of nameable parts but unnameable wholes. And it's within this kind of part-to-whole relationship that I find interest in the role of the primitive geometry. So within this, the Mondit's drawings for me also recall or kind of call attention to distinctions between things that are typically flat in architecture, like a facade, and things that are generally have more kind of, for lack of a better word, body to them, such as bodies and mass. So this is echoed by Colin Rowe, who says, when considering intercourse with a building, its face, however veiled, must always be a desirable and provocative item. The facade represents internal animation, both opaque and revealing. Heinrich Wolflin, on the other hand, spoke of the attendant qualities of bodies through weight, height, stability, by saying that with head and foot, back and front, we can comprehend the dumb, imprisoned existence of a bulky, memberless, amorphous conglomeration, heavy and immovable, as easily as the fine and clear disposition of something delicate and lightly articulated. In other words, Wolflin points more towards bodies and mass and issues associated with posture, figure, and association, whereas Rowe is more concerned with things like shape and figure of facade. So the generic original for me begins with the kind of premise that through multiplication and amplification of otherwise kind of generic or seemingly banal and even somewhat discarded architectural forms like spheres, cones, and cylinders in particular, we can actually achieve wholes that are both familiar and strange, known and unknown, nameable but unnameable. And the reception of these forms can then be characterized or qualified through things like distributed legibility or kind of visual oscillation between parts and wholes, a contextual deconcealing, or a way of an architectural form revealing or deconcealing something of ground or context. Cleavages and clefts as a way of maybe perhaps connecting a little bit to row and the internal animation of the exterior, so kind of isomorphism of the form and the aggregation between interior and exterior. Orientations without frontality, so no figural profiles with a kind of elevational ambivalence, and floating typological and associative illusions. So I think it's also important here to sort of give nod to both Bob Somel and his concern for legibility, and Jason Payne and his care for ambivalence, where the legibility could be understood as to be graphic and characterized by shape and easily communicative to large audiences with shared interpretations and shared readings. Whereas ambivalence would be something that frustrates the recognition of something by appearing as two or more things at once, and blurs a kind of form's own known associations into other things. So for me, the kind of formal project has to do with the middling between these two. In thinking about these historically, we could return maybe to past projects that would fit these categories, such as OMA's Sea Ferry Terminal, which Kohlhaas described as a form which resists classification, a kind of Rossian argument about type, or the kind of unsuspecting work of Peter Zumthor in this case with the New City Gate project. In some of my own work, a recent series of models called Poor Forms take aim at the idea of the generic original through the composition of spheres, cones, and cylinders. These models are sort of study models for other projects, one of which I'll show, others I don't. So they're kind of a foil on the one hand, and on the other hand, they're a kind of way of evidencing some of the principles and ideas I'm interested in the formal work. So here we can start to see the kind of relationship between a recognizable part and a sort of, for lack of a better word, ambivalent whole. And so we can start to now also differentiate between the novel and the familiar. So where the novel cares more for the kind of identity of a thing, the familiar nicely accommodates the generic and the commonplace. And this kind of genericism and commonality of particular parts, for me, seems to offer an idea about an elevated status of architectural form by casting the generic into new formal and compositional relationships. Part of the interest in this work, too, extends to ideas of deformation and manipulation. So here, however, where deconstructive techniques might be more interested in the kind of disjunction or destabilization of a form, these connect more strongly back to Heinrich Wölfflin with ideas of associations to bodies and bulk. So they kind of start to begin to encourage things like distended bellies, torquing torsos, and bloated parts. So it's about how far, where's the threshold between the kind of recognizability of the thing, and at what point do new associations start to gain new attention. And then maybe more recently is a kind of way of just thinking, once you have a thing, what are other ways of doing something to it? So once you have a form, how can you start to think about ways of cutting it? So this is just taking one of the poor forms and projecting a series of grids through that, in which what's revealed then is a kind of new kit of parts. So you still have a kind of legibility or a way of kind of evidence of the original sphere, cone, and cylinder aggregations, but their relationships now become altered by taking one thing and turning it into many, just through like kind of cheese slicing, cheese grating them. So I'm going to turn now to kind of set up an idea about context before I introduce a few projects that look to bring these together. I'm going to talk a lot now about the pastoral, and I think that the American pastoral is a kind of often eschewed context in the wake of a global metropolis, but for me, it's a kind of place of surrealism and politics. It's a place of folk art and technological sophistication. It's a place of avant-garde and kitsch. I think for me, it's a milieu of contradictions that's complex, not necessarily in appearance, but in the kind of cultural and political veils over something more significant. To frame this, I would recall, this is a painting, but I'm going to recall a anecdote from Nathaniel Hawthorne, where outside the woods of Concord, Massachusetts, he spent a half an hour recording the sounds he heard in nature, twigs snapping, birds, rustling leaves, etc. And part of what was included in that writing, his written record, is the distant blow of a train whistle. And so what at first seems kind of just irrelevant, in fact, actually signals something altogether more significant, which is the kind of introduction of technology into the pastoral. And I think that this, as we'll see, kind of acquires different cultural values as we go along. So it's really a way of kind of rethinking what was originally called the American garden. Part of this also then extends more specifically to architecture, where the pastoral or the countryside sort of historically oddly encapsulates both a sort of local ingenuity of the vernacular, but also the kind of regional bourgeois villas of, say, Palladio or Cornaro, Alvise Cornaro. Piero Vittorio Arelli writes of Cornaro: before Cornaro, country life, of which the villa was the most idealized form, was typically understood as radically anti-political, because it turned its back on the political space par excellence, the city. After Cornaro, however, this image was subverted. Rather than being predicated on the fundamentally apolitical ideas of disinterest and denial, the countryside became highly politicized by its promotion of a new formal model and its explicit rejection of the existing one, the Venetian city. It really goes on to say, Cornaro attempted to elevate the countryside to a new level that had a competing measure of cultural and social charisma. And then if we sort of fast forward to long after Palladio or Cornaro, and look at the work of the kind of 1960s and 70s, we find a lot of avant-garde architects sort of using the pastoral or the countryside as a medium for cultural critique. And so emphasis shifted from ideas of architecture as building practice to ideas of cultural critique. And it's interesting that here the context of it is decidedly non-urban. And so it's also interesting here that now technology had really moved from the kind of infrastructural or the industrial of the train to something decidedly more socially architectural. And it's in this kind of socially architectural realm that I find a lot of interest. So it also suggests that architectural form can precede context, and almost like a kind of pre-artifact to context, in which you start to leverage particular sensibilities and qualities and aesthetics of the context. And it's the kind of aesthetic of the place that becomes particularly interesting. Less interesting for me in a lot of the work would be the kind of top-down totalizing schemes, say, of Frank Lloyd Wright's Broadacre City. Rather, what's more interesting is the kind of de-networking, decoupling, de-infrastructuralizing of otherwise kind of covert or flaccid histories, objects, networks, and types. So the kind of planning schemes are less interesting than the kind of inheritance of a sort of object with its own sort of inherent qualities. So the first project that starts to look at this is the Star Gardens Purple Hollow project. And again, this becomes more interesting to me not through the lens of a map. So the map here is a catalog of all the Cargill agricultural company grain silos that are tied to the industrial railroads in the United States. But I find the kind of silo itself is a more interesting thing. So I think this is more interesting to me than the kind of categorizing this by a kind of network. So rather, I'm interested in where Christopher Wren might place this in a kind of category of customary beauty, where we can start to talk about its qualities. It's hollow, it's cylindrical, it cleaves and clefts at its seams. It's a kind of functional icon that is unabashed in its architectural parlance. It is just purely utilitarian. And so I think it's in the kind of accepting of this that we can begin to think about offering it new expressions, in particular in this case having to do with the interior, where rather than kind of contextualizing it by virtue of its network, we can begin to relieve it of that, and also in so doing relieve it of a kind of functional singularity and enable new forms of spatial work to be done. Climbing through them reveals a kind of oddness of their interior and of their interiority. So despite the kind of isomorphic quality of the interior to the exterior, this photograph's taken in the foundation of a silo in western Kansas, speaks to the kind of unease of the interior space. So it also reveals a really sharp contrast of the interior to the exterior openness of the context. I think in thinking of these silos in the kind of their abandoned state and wondering and kind of speculating on potential reuse or other uses, something like this becomes a kind of typological escape route. So Einstein Tower by Eric Mendelsohn shares a lot of kind of qualities of a cylinder. It's primarily oriented vertically, meaning it primarily looks up. It encourages one to look up. Yet its expressive instrumentality relies on its ability to do scientific work. So maybe less interesting to me than the scientific work was an idea of a kind of something that's just still observational but produces a different effect. And so in thinking of the interior of the silo and relieving it from a kind of functionality or a singular function suited to one thing, an idea of kind of coupling an archetype unfamiliar to a silo, such as the kind of opulent dome, which is something I'll return to later, actually makes a kind of very easy comparison or compatibility between a cylinder and a sphere, which is actually the same formal diagram of the pantheon. So in thinking about this and alleviating a kind of functional work to be done and preferencing instead the atmospheric or the leisurely, beginning to catalog 16 constellation patterns within the circumference of the silo, arraying them around the center point of what becomes a dome, allows for two things. It produces a kind of ornamentation on the one hand, and yet it also produces a way in which you actually do read a kind of constellation at one moment, but it's so obscured by the other overlapping patterns that it becomes a kind of ornamental difference between the instrumentality of Einstein's tower and the just kind of Folly space. In other words, it's like a move from a kind of astronomical to the astrological, but without the kind of metaphysical aspects of it. So seen in section, the color purple begins to signal a shift away from the functional, a kind of defamiliarization or estrangement of the interior of a silo to something other, also amplified by the kind of bed suspended in the middle. Then by day, a kind of perforated dome produces this kaleidoscopic array of light. It kind of tracks the interior of the silo in this kind of odd, no longer functional, but really atmospheric or kind of sightless vessel in a way. By night, it becomes a kind of celestial folly in which particular constellations come in and out of alignment, but really it's more about a kind of device for stargazing, or a way of kind of even inventing new constellations through what are otherwise misalignments. And then finally, whereas the kind of exterior of the silo is allowed to continue to age and weather, the dome produces a kind of curiosity that hints at the interior transformation. So similar to the two girls looking into the HVAC vent that I showed earlier, the dome encourages one to peek inside of something that is otherwise seemingly banal or commonplace, with the realization that there's something more curious going on. I'm going to return to the machine in the garden and kind of return to some of Hawthorne's work, but sometime later. This is kind of a preamble to the follow-up project. So I'll start by showing this farmhouse, or at least what's built to look like a farmhouse, a typical farmhouse. But in fact, this is a kind of inaccurate overpainting of what's really going on here. So this is a house that's kind of trapped between the local territoriality of a kind of iconic farmhouse and between a kind of global imperative. So this is actually a missile launch control center where 80 feet below ground, missileers would sit in 12-hour shifts for a period of 22 years with command over 10 missiles in the kind of local, broad local area. So the kind of typological camouflage tied to political agenda and global ideological conflict, I think is a particularly interesting place for architecture to find itself. And I would say also, I guess in this slide, there are clues that is not quite your ordinary farmhouse. The fence for one, the massive side yard vents for another, the size of the transformers. If those weren't enough, there's a helipad in the front, which is like really atypical for a farmhouse. Never appears in Grant Wood's paintings. So, and really, I think what's interesting about this is it's 150 years after Hawthorne's recording at Sleepy Hollow, where now all of a sudden we've moved from the externalized blow of a train whistle in the pastoral scene to something decidedly more sinister, something that is possibly the most extreme technological garden tool or garden object, the intercontinental ballistic missile silo. So the cultural weight of the machine in the garden was suddenly much more significant. So this is a map of one of four kind of missile territories in the U.S. where there's over 1,500 missile silos tucked into the American landscape. So these are really kind of expansive, vast areas that are extremely complex, and I would pause here just to note that to kind of properly introduce all of the contingencies around them would require a full lecture. So what's more interesting here to me is the kind of physical attributes, the aesthetics of these places, rather than the kind of ideological or political conditions which surround their construction or decommission. And so something like this is the context. These are many of these sites that is decidedly pastoral. It's actually kind of totally banal in a way, yet in knowing what we know of the sites, they actually start to edge up against things like the sublime or the surreal. And this, for me, kind of really exposes the inherent aesthetic contradictions of these sites that I find quite interesting. So with that as the kind of preamble, we'll turn to the Belvedere and Berms, where here's the context for this for this speculative project. The tickers on the horizon indicate other missile sites within a 10-mile radius from where I'm standing. And again, the site for me is more painterly. I feel very painterly and sublime in a way, but it's not about a kind of romanticism or nostalgia. And then if we just introduce the Belvedere quickly as a type, it's traditionally just an elevated platform for the purposes of looking out over a pleasing scene. And so by virtue of such programmatic responsibility, it's kind of a quintessential pastoral or picturesque type. And given its kind of simple programmatic needs, it allows one to focus really heavily on the kind of formal and spatial problems. So it has a kind of architectural objectivity to it. So I'm going to return now to kind of exemplify again ideas of the generic original. So here in the Belvedere crown, it's composed of 11 spheres, 20 cones, and 8 cylinders in aggregate. Each of the spheres equates to one interior room in the Belvedere, while the cones sort of connect them into one and congeal them into one mass in interior volume. An idea of distributed legibility, and then contextual deconcealing, where given the nature of the Belvedere and its kind of proximity to 199 other missile sites, this is sitting on top of one of the missile silos, it begins to sort of neutralize this area. It begins to sort of recast the sort of former politicized landscape through de-networking, de-infrastructuralizing the kind of network that it was once a part of. So in other words, the Belvedere acquires a kind of new resonance with ground without having been formed or entangled by the consequences of political or ideological contingencies. Rather, it aims to incentivize the subterranean cylinder through new spatial and social possibilities. The exterior cleaves and clefts, which result from the interior rooms and balconies, seen in this kind of 8-foot-tall model, both distinguish the individual parts, yet they also are the same thing that kind of commonalizes it. So it operates somewhere between kind of like a bloated stomach and a flexed muscle. You can't quite tell if it's bloated or taut. Things are moving into and out of one another, or they're kind of congealing into one thing. And then kind of orientation without frontality. So there's not a kind of face to it. There's no singular right way to actually approach or read the object or the building, but there is a kind of one orientation of its vertical stance. And the second part of this project has to do with an idea of landscape. And here we shift from the kind of lucid object or the lucid profile of an object to something decidedly less controlled. So Giacometti's face drawing offers a nice segue for this, in which rather than a kind of idea of composition of parts, in fact, there are no parts, there are no shapes, there is no profile. Instead, the recognition of the figure comes out of the density and intensity of lines. So it's kind of a wronging of a line. It's kind of almost a wrong way to draw as an architect. And the imprecision is actually what reveals the kind of figure. So in a similar way, these drawings are kind of expressive material compositions with inherent ambient effects that are probably better understood through sensing than through deciphering, meaning that they're better understood through density than they are through area, for example, or coloration than area. So they can't, it's similar to Giacometti's face drawing, they also can't be bound by a singular profile, and they exhibit no strong figuration. They're made with ink, wax, dye, salt, and water. Therefore, they kind of embody color, texture, and variable scales of materiality. You can't quite tell at what scale you're looking at this, and the kind of obfuscation of scale is something I'm interested in a lot of the work. These drawings operate really optically, not pictorially, so you're not meant to kind of read any figure. You can scale in and out, and they operate without a center, effectively. So in a longer discussion, I would trace a kind of lineage of these from colori techniques in painting and juxtaposition to designo techniques in drawing. I think suffice to say for here, the drawings are really mediums which begin to blur edges, they lack profiles, and they require, that in order to bring them into a kind of architectural conversation, they require the necessity of abstraction through translation. And so, similar to the Giacometti face drawing here in the kind of process of translation, the digital allows a way of kind of reading the drawing. It reads the materiality of the drawing, the material organization of the drawing. It begins to produce, in a similar way to Giacometti's face drawing, the kind of figure of the drawing through density and intensity of line, not through bound profile. So it's in juxtaposition to the kind of spheres, cones, and cylinders. This is a site drawing for the Belvedere project that we're still on, where this is 5 drawings composed into one, so they're kind of grafted and spliced together, each one of the 5 responding to some kind of variable of site, whether it be topography or some kind of found object on site, and then with the kind of net effect being one of producing a field of berms. And so the digital drawing really operates as a kind of superimposition of art over politics. So it's a technique for defamiliarization, the art being the kind of drawing, politics being the landscape, and it alleviates the kind of charge of the landscape before and offers in new identities. And then a kind of double exploded axon of all parts. So that brings us to this, which is the project 4 Domes Nowhere in the Middle, which is the project in the gallery, and this will be the last work I show. And this actually came out of an exhibition that I did in February and March, and somebody said to me after the opening that they really appreciated how a lot of the work took place in the middle of nowhere. And I think that was very interesting to me, and I'm not sure if it was like high praise or like dismissive, but it was very curious to me about what is the middle of nowhere, and like what do we get if we understand the middle of nowhere? It must sort of inherently exhibit a kind of spatial paradox or a spatial problem. And so this is it. So I was just kind of thinking, if there's a middle of nowhere, then certainly it must be proximate to the periphery of somewhere. And so in that is always a kind of spatial problem, I think. And so even in this image, we start to read, again, the kind of maybe a more docile machine effect here of the hay bale relative to a missile silo, but there's still something happening here that I think is interesting in terms of context and form. In reading some Vidler, he says the perplexity of living might be interpreted through a theory of the uncanny that destabilizes traditional notions of center and periphery, the spatial forms of the national. To comprehend how that boundary that secures the cohesive limits of the Western nation may imperceptibly turn into a contentious internal liminality that provides a place from which to speak of and as the minority, the exilic, the marginal, and the emergent. So there's actually there's actually 6 middles of America. I'm showing you 4. The first in the kind of upper left corner is in South Dakota, which is if you include Alaska and Hawaii, but you don't include the curvature of the earth. The one most in the middle, near Lebanon, Kansas, is just if you include the boundary of the United States with no curvature of earth and you exclude Alaska and Hawaii. The one just below that is if you include the curvature of the earth, but you still exclude Alaska and Hawaii. And the one to the kind of the furthest one right, that's if you use a PC, then that's the middle of America for you on Google Maps and Google Earth. And if you use a Mac, your center is 181 miles east. And this actually comes out of, it's like, it doesn't affect anything. I just find the geographic oddity curious. And it just comes out of the 2 people who wrote the JavaScript codes debating on the middle, and one was from a hometown near where he set it for a PC. So I don't know, these mapping things are just interesting to me for their kind of strangeness. We'd also, as we suspect, if we track the middle of America over time, it sort of is this jumping around lines that sort of reconfigures itself within a ever-changing boundary. It's also interesting that it moves from something much more urban and continually becomes decidedly non-urban. This is the site in South Dakota, and it's actually one of their bigger, I don't know the number, but it's one of their bigger tourist attractions, which I found really odd because there's something about the kind of psychology of finding the center or something. So my favorite one is actually this one, the U.S. Center Chapel. This one is in Lebanon, Kansas. And this one's particularly interesting because it recalls a specific architectural type, which I like. And in recalling that type, it also being a chapel, it recalls for me Philip Johnson's Roofless Church. So this, I think, this is now the direct segue into the work in the gallery, which for me, Johnson's Roofless Church and the kind of disembodiment of the dome from some kind of institutional underfoot also alleviates any kind of cultural predetermination about the significance of the dome, its meaning, and so on, and instead we can focus on the dome as a kind of architecturally objective problem, form, space, order, geometry, mass, figure, material, all of the things that we find in Mondit's drawings as well. Or I'm particularly fond of Saul LeWitt's stacked domes from the early 2000s, just because they focus so strongly on things like aggregation, stacking, and kind of simple means, with relatively simple geometries that kind of aggregate into more complex things. So this is a kind of first look at the plans and sections of the domes in the gallery. I'm going to pause here to say that the domes, what's in the gallery is not kind of a condition of some extensive survey of dome typologies over history, nor is it kind of a concluding statement on any other project. It's kind of just a way to produce a conversation around domes as it pertains to form and material, as well as context. So in looking at Philip Johnson's plan for the Roofless Church, there's 6 circles that kind of spin around a center point of a 7th. What's not shown in the plan is that in that middle circle, there's about a 15-foot tall statue. So in a centralized plan, you normally would expect to occupy the center. In this one, you can't. So in comparing the two, this is the drawing of mine on the right. And when we see the dome itself, the shingles are a kind of nod to Philip Johnson, but they also sort of confuse that status because they appear wiggly. There's 7,000 of them on there, and they appear to kind of not quite align with the geometry, which I find interesting for their kind of way of kind of obscuring the cleanliness of the geometric plan. Again, the cleaving and the clefting, where the material starts to sort of more closely align to the cleaves. And then in thinking about Philip Johnson's not allowing the center, here I have hills so that you actually start to occupy the very middle of the dome. And so just really quickly to end on these guys, all of the domes sort of borrow from a particular plan type, plan organization. But this one's maybe the one that's least likely because it's so informal, but they all begin to adopt a certain kind of materiality and organization that borrows from an existing plan type but abstracts it in a way where it's still a dome, but it does it and advances on a kind of conversation through spheres, cones, and cylinders. And then the last thing I'd say is the materiality of them is a kind of charge at thinking about material realism in architectural models. So the patinaed one, the gilded, the stripes, and the shingles all sort of aim to differentiate between are they historic or are they kind of futuristic domes. Thank you.